The afterburner flames of Captain Sarah Mitchell's F-15 Eagle roared against the pre-dawn darkness as she banked hard left at 25,000 feet, her aircraft's twin engines screaming through the thin air above the Nevada desert. 4 red dots glowed on her radar display, closing fast from the northeast. Enemy fighters, confirmed hostile, inbound toward civilian airspace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Viper lead, this is Control Tower, the voice crackled through her headset. You are ordered to maintain a defensive perimeter only. Do not engage unless fired upon. Repeat, do not engage. Sarah's grip tightened on the stick as she studied the tactical display. The 4 aircraft were moving in perfect formation, their signature suggesting advanced fighter jets, not the outdated interceptors intelligence had predicted. Behind them, 200 miles to the south, lay the city of Phoenix with its population of 1.7 million people. Control, Viper lead, she responded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Hostile aircraft are maintaining course toward populated areas. Request permission to intercept. Negative, Viper lead. Row is crystal clear. You are not authorized to engage. Maintain observation only. Sarah Mitchell had been flying F-15s for 8 years, ever since she'd graduated top of her class from the Air Force Academy. She'd flown combat missions over Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Always following orders, always playing by the rules. But she'd never faced a situation like this one. The red dots on her radar were moving at Mach 1.2, descending gradually as they approached the civilian corridor. Military analysts had been tracking these particular aircraft for 3 days since they'd appeared on satellite imagery at a rogue airbase in northern Mexico. Intelligence suggested they were part of a mercenary operation, possibly backed by a hostile state actor, but political considerations had limited the American response to observation and diplomatic protests. Viper lead, you are ordered to maintain safe distance and observe only, the tower controller repeated. Do not engage under any circumstances. Sarah's radar warning receiver remained silent, indicating the approaching aircraft weren't actively targeting her, but their flight path was unmistakable. They were heading directly toward Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport, where commercial flights were beginning their morning departures. She thought about her younger brother Danny, who worked as an air traffic controller at Sky Harbor. He'd be starting his shift in 30 minutes, coordinating the takeoffs and landings of passenger jets filled with families, business travelers, and tourists. The timing wasn't coincidental. Control, Viper lead. Request clarification on rules of engagement. These aircraft pose immediate threat to civilian populations. Viper lead, your orders are clear. Maintain observation. Do not engage. Sarah switched to her squadron frequency, hoping to reach her wingmen, but Lieutenant Jake Morrison's F-15 was 80 miles south, responding to what had turned out to be a false alarm. She was alone, 4 against 1, with American civilians in the crosshairs. The lead enemy aircraft began transmitting on emergency frequencies, a message that chilled Sarah to the bone. American forces, this is Strike Leader. We are conducting a demonstration of capability. Clear Phoenix airspace immediately or face consequences. It wasn't a random attack. It was a calculated provocation designed to test American resolve and demonstrate that even the continental United States wasn't safe from determined adversaries. The 4 aircraft represented a new kind of warfare, deniable operations conducted by skilled pilots flying advanced aircraft under the flag of no nation. Sarah's tactical computer identified the aircraft as Su-35 Flankeries, Russian-built air superiority fighters that were among the most capable adversaries an F-15 could face. Each aircraft carried a full load of air-to-air missiles and possessed radar systems that could track multiple targets simultaneously. 4 against 1, they should have been able to overwhelm her defenses easily, but Sarah Mitchell hadn't survived. 8 years of military flying by accepting impossible odds. She adjusted her radar settings, switching to combat mode and beginning target acquisition procedures. The F-15 Eagle was older than the Su-35s, but it had been upgraded with the latest avionics and missile systems. More importantly, Sarah had trained extensively in air-to-air combat, logging over 200 hours in advanced fighter tactics. Control. Viper lead. Hostile aircraft are now 150 miles from Phoenix and maintaining an attack profile. Request immediate authorization to engage. Negative Viper lead. Political considerations override tactical situations. You are ordered to withdraw to a safe distance. Sarah's blood ran cold. Political considerations. While enemy aircraft approached, American civilians, decision-makers in Washington, were worried about international incidents and diplomatic repercussions. The same bureaucratic thinking that had allowed these aircraft to operate from Mexico for 3 days while committees debated. Response options. She thought about the passengers aboard the morning flights departing Sky Harbor, families heading to Disney World, executives traveling to business meetings, elderly couples visiting grandchildren. None of them knew that 4 hostile aircraft were approaching their city, and none of them would have time to react when the attack began. Viper lead, control tower. You are ordered to return to base immediately. Acknowledge. Sarah looked at her fuel gauge. She had enough for perhaps 40 minutes of combat operations, less if she engaged the afterburners for high-speed maneuvering. The hostile aircraft would reach Phoenix in 12 minutes. Commercial flights would be taking off in 8 minutes. She made her choice. Control Viper lead. I'm experiencing radio difficulties. Breaking off to investigate. Sarah switched off her radio and pushed the throttles forward, feeling the F-15's twin Pratt & Whitney engines respond with a surge of power that pressed her back into her ejection seat. The aircraft leaped forward, closing the distance to the hostile formation at over 1,000 miles per hour. Her radar locked onto the lead Su-35, the tone in her headset confirming missile acquisition. The IM-12 OMRAAM missiles beneath her wings were among the most advanced air-to-air weapons in the world, capable of engaging targets at ranges exceeding 50 miles. But 4 against 1 meant she'd have to be perfect. The lead Su-35 began evasive maneuvers as its radar warning receiver detected Sarah's lock-on. The formation spread out, each aircraft taking a different vector to complicate her targeting solutions. These weren't amateur pilots flying obsolete aircraft. These were professionals who understood air combat tactics and had trained extensively in their advanced fighters. Sarah's first missile launch came at 35 miles, targeting the formation leader. The AMRAAM streaked away from her aircraft, its rocket motor igniting as it climbed toward its target. Immediately, she maneuvered to avoid the inevitable counterstrike, pulling 7 Gs as she turned toward the second aircraft. The lead Su-35 deployed chaff and flares while diving toward the deck, trying to break the missile's lock. But Sarah had anticipated the maneuver, and her missile stayed true. The explosion lit up the morning sky as the first hostile aircraft disintegrated in a fireball visible from 30 miles away. 3 against 1. The remaining Su-35s immediately went to afterburner, accelerating toward Sarah's position while launching their own missiles. Her radar warning receiver screamed as multiple threats appeared on her display. 4 missiles inbound, all targeted at her aircraft. Sarah rolled inverted and pulled toward the earth, diving at nearly vertical angle while deploying her own countermeasures. The F-15 Eagle was renowned for its ability to accelerate and climb, but in this situation, she needed to use gravity to build speed quickly. 2 of the incoming missiles lost lock and detonated harmlessly, but the other 2 stayed with her. Sarah waited until the last possible moment, then pulled up hard, the G-forces threatening to black her out as she climbed back toward the hostile formation. One missile passed beneath her aircraft, its proximity fuse failing to detonate. The other exploded close enough to send shrapnel through her left wing, puncturing hydraulic lines and damaging her flight control systems. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel, but the F-15 continued flying. Sarah's second missile found its target as she climbed, striking the second Su-35 in the engine compartment. The aircraft didn't explode but began trailing smoke and debris as it fell toward the desert floor, its pilot ejecting seconds before impact. 2 against 1. The remaining hostile aircraft had used the engagement to close distance, and Sarah found herself in a classic dogfight scenario. The Su-35s had superior maneuverability at low speeds, but the F-15 had better acceleration and climb performance. The battle would be decided by pilot skill and tactical awareness. Sarah rolled left as tracers from a 30mm cannon streaked past her canopy. The Su-35s were armed with internal guns, and they were trying to force her into a turning fight where their superior agility would be decisive. Instead, Sarah climbed, using her aircraft's power-to-weight ratio to gain altitude advantage. Third Su-35 followed her climb, its pilot skilled enough to maintain pursuit, despite the F-15's superior acceleration. At 30,000 feet, Sarah suddenly rolled and dove, pulling the hostile aircraft into a high-speed descent that favored her heavier fighter. Her third missile launch came at point-blank range, only 2 miles apart. The AIM-120 had barely armed when it struck the pursuing Su-35, the explosion so close that debris peppered Sarah's aircraft. Her canopy cracked and cabin pressure began bleeding away, but she was still flying. 1 against 1. The final Su-35 had used the engagement to position itself behind Sarah's aircraft, and she could see muzzle flashes in her mirrors as the pilot fired his cannon. Rounds struck her fuselage, and she felt the aircraft shudder as critical systems took damage. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah's options were limited. She was low on fuel, her aircraft was damaged, and her opponent was skilled and desperate. But she had one advantage. She was defending her home, and that was worth more than any tactical consideration. She pulled the F-15 into a climbing turn, bleeding speed to force the Su-35 to overshoot. The Russian-built fighter flashed past her canopy, its pilot pulling hard to avoid giving Sarah a shooting opportunity. But Sarah had anticipated the maneuver. Her final missile streaked toward the Su-35 at minimum range, striking the aircraft's tail section and severing its flight controls. The fighter entered an uncontrolled spin, falling toward the desert as its pilot fought to regain control. Sarah watched the enemy pilot eject, his parachute deploying as his aircraft impacted the ground in a ball of flame. 4 aircraft down, all pilots accounted for. Phoenix was safe, but as Sarah turned her damaged F-15 toward home, she realized that her troubles were just beginning. She disobeyed direct orders, engaged in combat without authorization, and potentially created an international incident. The 4 aircraft she'd shot down would be investigated, their origins traced, and political consequences would follow. Her radio crackled to life as she approached Nellis Air Force Base. Viper lead, this is the control tower. You are ordered to land immediately and report to base operations. Do not leave your aircraft until security personnel arrive. Sarah's hands shook as she lowered the landing gear, adrenaline and exhaustion combining to make even simple tasks difficult. She'd saved Phoenix, protected American civilians, and demonstrated that even advanced enemy aircraft could be defeated by skilled pilots and well-maintained fighters. She'd also ended her military career. As her F-15 touched down on the runway, Sarah could see the security vehicles waiting. military police investigators, and senior officers who would decide whether she was a hero or a rogue pilot who'd violated orders and endangered American foreign policy. The aircraft rolled to a stop, and Sarah shut down the engines, listening to the metal cool and contract around her. Through her cracked canopy, she could see the first security personnel approaching, their expressions serious and professional. Captain Sarah Mitchell had always followed orders, always played by the rules, always trusted that the system would make the right decisions. But sometimes the system failed, and individual soldiers had to choose between obedience and conscience. She'd made her choice at 25,000 feet, and now she would face the consequences on the ground. The fluorescent lights in the base commander's office hummed like angry wasps as Captain Sarah Mitchell sat at rigid attention, her flight suit still stained with hydraulic fluid from her damaged F-15. Across from her, Colonel William Harrison shuffled through incident reports with the methodical precision of a man who'd built his career on following procedures and avoiding controversy. "Captain Mitchell," he began, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in uniform, "you are hereby charged with willful disobedience of a direct order, unauthorized engagement of foreign aircraft, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline under the Uniform Code of Military Justice." Sarah's defense attorney, Major Rebecca Chen, squeezed her shoulder. Chun was young, sharp, and one of the few JAG officers who believed Sarah had acted correctly. But belief didn't always translate to legal victory in military courts. "Sir, respectfully, my client prevented a potential catastrophe," Major Chun interjected. 4 hostile aircraft were approaching civilian airspace with stated hostile intent. "Overruled," Colonel Harrison replied without looking up from his papers. The defendant's role was reconnaissance and observation. She was explicitly ordered not to engage. Sarah bit back her response. She wanted to stand up and shout that she'd prevented a terrorist attack, that Phoenix Sky Harbor was still operational because of her actions, that the morning news wasn't leading with stories of civilian casualties. But military justice operated on different principles than civilian law, and good intentions didn't excuse disobedience. The charges were read in full. Violation of Article 86 for failure to obey orders, Article 87 for missing movement when she'd ignored the recall command, and Article 134 for conduct that brought discredit upon the armed forces. Each charge carried potential sentences that could end her career and result in imprisonment. "The prosecution will demonstrate," Colonel Harrison continued, "that Captain Mitchell's actions, while perhaps well-intentioned, violated fundamental principles of military discipline and chain of command. When pilots decide they know better than their commanding officers, the entire structure of military authority breaks down." The way he emphasized pilots made it clear this wasn't just about disobedience. Sarah had been one of only 12 women to complete the Air Force's elite fighter pilot training program, and her success had been watched carefully by those who believed women couldn't handle the pressures of air combat. Major Chun stood to address the court. "Captain Mitchell has served with distinction for 8 years. She's logged over 2,000 flight hours in combat aircraft, completed 3 overseas deployments, and maintained a spotless record until this incident. Her actions saved American lives." "Her actions," Colonel Harrison replied coldly, "potentially triggered an international incident. The aircraft she engaged were operating under unclear legal authority, and her engagement of them has created diplomatic complications that could affect American foreign policy for years." Sarah felt the familiar knot of anger in her stomach. The same bureaucratic thinking that had prevented her from engaging the hostile aircraft was now being used to justify her prosecution. Politics mattered more than protecting American civilians. The prosecution's case began with a parade of witnesses who testified about the importance of following orders in military operations. Command and control officers explained how unauthorized actions could compromise larger strategic objectives. Intelligence analysts discussed the complexity of international law regarding airspace violations and rules of engagement. Major General Patricia Hoffman, Sarah's wing commander, took the stand with obvious reluctance. Hoffman had been Sarah's mentor, the senior officer who'd encouraged her to pursue fighter training despite institutional resistance. General Hoffman, the prosecutor asked, did Captain Mitchell receive clear orders regarding her mission parameters? She did. And were those orders to maintain observation only, without engaging hostile aircraft? They were. In your professional opinion, was Captain Mitchell's engagement of the hostile aircraft a violation of those orders? General Hoffman paused, her eyes meeting Sarah's briefly. Technically, yes. But the situation was complex, and Captain Mitchell was forced to make a split-second decision under extreme pressure. General, in your experience, what happens to military effectiveness when individual officers decide to override their orders based on their personal judgment? Military discipline requires adherence to lawful orders, Hoffman replied carefully. But it also requires officers to exercise judgment in extraordinary circumstances. The prosecutor pressed harder. General, are you suggesting that Captain Mitchell's judgment should supersede explicit orders from her chain of command? I'm suggesting that combat situations are complex, and armchair quarterbacking rarely captures the full picture. Sarah appreciated General Hoffman's careful defense, but she could see the court-martial panel's expressions hardening. Military officers who'd built their careers on following orders were uncomfortable with the idea that individual judgment could override explicit commands. The technical testimony was damning. Communications experts played recordings of Sarah's radio conversations, emphasizing the moment she'd been ordered to return to base. Flight data recovered from her aircraft showed her deliberate course change toward the hostile formation. Weapons systems data confirmed her missile launches had been deliberate and precisely targeted. The evidence clearly shows, the prosecutor concluded, that Captain Mitchell received lawful orders, acknowledged those orders, and then deliberately chose to disobey them. Her actions, regardless of outcome, represent a fundamental breach of military discipline. Sarah's turn to testify came on the fourth day of the court-martial. The courtroom was packed with fellow pilots, many of whom had flown combat missions under her leadership. Their presence was supposed to be supportive, but Sarah knew her testimony would determine whether she was remembered as a hero or a cautionary tale. Captain Mitchell, Major Chun began, please tell the court about your military background. Sarah's voice was steady and professional. 8 years of commissioned service. Graduated summa cum laude from the Air Force Academy. Completed undergraduate pilot training with distinction. Selected for fighter aircraft and completed F-15 training at the top of my class. How many combat missions have you flown? 147 across 3 deployments. Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Have you ever been disciplined for failure to follow orders? No, ma'am. This is my first disciplinary action. Major. Chung walked Sarah through her combat record, highlighting missions where she'd followed orders despite personal risk. Instances where she'd demonstrated exceptional judgment under pressure, and commendations from superior officers who'd praised her professionalism. Captain Mitchell, on the morning in question, what did you observe about the hostile aircraft's flight path? They were flying directly toward Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Their course and speed indicated they intended to overfly or potentially attack civilian infrastructure. What was your assessment of the threat to civilian populations? Immediate and credible. The aircraft were advanced fighters carrying full weapon loads. Their leader had issued a threat over emergency frequencies, demanding that civilian aircraft clear the area. What went through your mind when you received orders not to engage? Sarah looked directly at the court-martial panel. I thought about my oath as an officer, ma'am. To support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I thought about the civilians who would be put at risk if those aircraft reached populated areas. Did you consider the possibility that your superiors had information you didn't possess? Yes, ma'am. But I also considered the possibility that decision makers hundreds of miles away might not fully understand the tactical situation in combat. Split-second decisions often can't wait for committee review. The prosecutor's cross-examination was brutal. He hammered on discipline, the importance of following orders, and the dangers of individual officers making strategic decisions without proper authority. Captain Mitchell, if every pilot decided when to follow orders and when to ignore them, what would happen to Air Force effectiveness? Sir, I believe good officers use their judgment to fulfill the spirit of their orders, even when circumstances prevent them from following the letter. Are you suggesting that your judgment is superior to that of your commanding officers? I'm suggesting that the officer on the scene sometimes has information that can't be communicated through radio transmissions. My job was to protect American interests, and that's what I did. Your job was to follow orders. Instead, you chose to engage in unauthorized combat, potentially creating an international incident. Sarah felt her temper rising. Sir, with respect, those aircraft were preparing to attack American civilians. Sometimes preventing a catastrophe requires accepting smaller risks. Captain Mitchell, who authorized you to make that determination? The same oath that every officer takes, sir. To defend the Constitution and protect American citizens. Did your oath include authorization to ignore direct orders from your chain of command? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knew her answer would determine her fate, but she also knew she couldn't lie under oath or compromise her principles. No, sir. But my oath also didn't include standing by while American civilians were threatened. The courtroom erupted in murmurs until the judge restored order. Sarah had just confirmed everything the prosecution wanted to prove, that she believed her personal judgment superseded military authority. As Sarah returned to her seat, she caught sight of the gallery. In the back row sat 23 pilots from her squadron, men and women who'd flown combat missions under her leadership. They weren't supposed to be there, weren't supposed to show support that could be seen as influencing the court, but they'd come anyway. Lieutenant Commander Mark Stevens, who'd been her wingman on 3 deployments, sat in the front of that group. His eyes met hers with a gratitude that transcended military protocol. She'd saved his life twice in combat, and he'd never forgotten it, but the court-martial panel's expressions remained stone cold, already convinced that Sarah represented a dangerous precedent. She'd acted heroically, but heroism that violated orders was still violation of orders. The verdict came after 2 hours of deliberation. Sarah stood at attention as the panel's president, Brigadier General Thomas Wright, read the decision. Captain Sarah Mitchell, this court finds you guilty of all charges. While we acknowledge that your actions may have prevented civilian casualties, military discipline cannot be subordinated to individual judgment, regardless of good intentions. Sentence is as follows: reduction in rank to first lieutenant, forfeiture of all pay and allowances for 6 months, and dismissal from the United States Air Force. This court-martial is adjourned. Sarah's military career was over. 8 years of service, 3 combat deployments, and a spotless record had been erased by a single decision to protect American civilians. She'd saved Phoenix and destroyed her own future in the process. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah sat alone at the defense table, staring at the eagles on her uniform that she'd soon remove forever. She'd known the risks when she'd engaged those aircraft, but she'd never imagined the system would punish her so severely for succeeding. Major Chun approached with the formal dismissal paperwork. Sarah, I'm sorry. We'll appeal, but appeals rarely overturn court-martial convictions, Sarah finished. I know. Through the courtroom windows, she could see F-15s taking off from Nellis Air Force Base, their twin engines climbing toward the Nevada sky. Other pilots were flying the missions she'd never complete, protecting the country she'd served with distinction until the moment she'd chosen conscience over compliance. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been trained to make split-second decisions in combat, to use her judgment when lives were at stake, to accept responsibility for protecting American interests. But when she'd done exactly that, the system had discarded her like a malfunctioning component. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that good officers followed orders and that military discipline was essential for effective operations. But she'd also believed that some things were more important than following orders, and that belief had cost her everything she'd worked for. As she walked out of the courtroom, still wearing the uniform she'd soon surrender, Sarah wondered if she'd made the right choice. 4 enemy aircraft destroyed, American civilians protected, and her own career sacrificed in the process. She'd answered that question at 25,000 feet, and she'd live with the consequences on the ground. The media coverage began before Sarah had even cleared the base. News outlets had picked up the story of the female fighter pilot who'd violated orders to shoot down 4 enemy aircraft over American airspace. Some painted her as a hero who'd prevented a terrorist attack, others as a rogue officer who'd compromised American foreign policy. Sarah's apartment in Las Vegas was a study in military precision, even after her dismissal. Her uniforms hung in perfect order, her awards and decorations arranged with mathematical accuracy, and a single photograph on her nightstand showed her graduating flight school class. She'd stared at that photograph every morning for 3 months, wondering where it had all gone wrong. The dismissal had been devastating, but the aftermath was worse. Potential employers saw dismissed from military service, and their eyes went cold. Defense contractors wanted team players, not pilots who'd been court-martialed for insubordination. Airlines were hesitant to hire someone whose primary qualification was shooting down enemy aircraft. She'd applied for commercial pilot positions, military contractor jobs, even flight instructor positions at civilian schools. The responses were uniformly polite and uniformly negative. Her technical qualifications were exceptional, but her disciplinary record raised questions about judgment and reliability. Sarah was down to her last few $100s when the letter arrived. The envelope was expensive, heavy cream paper with a corporate watermark she didn't recognize. No return address, just her name written in professional script. Miss Sarah Mitchell, not captain, not lieutenant, just the civilian title she was still adjusting to. Inside was a single sheet of matching letterhead and a business card. The letter was brief. Miss Mitchell, your reputation precedes you. We represent clients who value results over protocol, skill over politics. If you're interested in putting your considerable talents to productive use, call the number below. Ask for Falcon. Compensation begins at $300,000 annually. D. Sterling. Sarah read the letter 3 times before examining the business card. Sterling Defense Solutions, embossed in gold lettering, with a phone number that had more digits than typical domestic lines. She'd heard whispers about Sterling during her military service, a private military company that took contracts in places where official military forces couldn't operate. They worked in the gray areas between government policy and mission necessity, providing services that didn't officially exist for clients who paid premium rates for plausible deniability. Their pilots flew unmarked aircraft on missions that never appeared in official reports, and they were paid enough to forget about the moral complexities. $300,000. It was more money than Sarah had ever imagined making, enough to rebuild her life completely. But it was also the kind of offer that usually came with strings attached and moral compromises that she'd spent 8 years in uniform trying to avoid. She picked up her phone and dialed the number. The voice that answered was crisp and professional, with the kind of careful diction that suggested international operations. Sterling Defense Solutions, how may I direct your call? I'd like to speak with Falcon, please. May I have your name? Sarah Mitchell. One moment, please. Classical music filled the line while Sarah waited, something she recognized but couldn't name. Her father had been a classical music enthusiast, playing symphonies during Sunday dinners. When the world was simpler and her biggest concern was making varsity basketball. "Ms. Mitchell?" The new voice was male, American, with the confident tone of someone who'd spent time in dangerous places. "Thank you for calling. I'm David Sterling. I trust you received our correspondence?" "I did. How did you know where to find me?" "We make it our business to know where exceptional pilots end up, especially those who've been poorly treated by bureaucrats, more interested in politics than protecting American lives." Sarah felt a familiar spark of anger. "You know about the court-martial?" "We know about the engagement. 4 Su-35 flankers eliminated in air-to-air combat, single-handed defense of civilian airspace, and outstanding airmanship under extreme pressure. We also know about the colonel who decided that following orders was more important than preventing potential terrorist attacks. What do you want?" "We want to offer you a job, Ms. Mitchell. A chance to use your skills for clients who appreciate excellence over conformity." Sarah walked to her window, looking out at the Las Vegas skyline. 3 months ago, she'd been one of the Air Force's top fighter pilots, trusted with multi-million-dollar aircraft and critical national security missions. Now she was considering whether she could afford groceries next week. What kind of job? You familiar with the South China Sea?" Sarah frowned. The region had been a source of international tension for years, with multiple nations claiming territorial rights and China increasingly assertive about controlling shipping lanes. Military briefings covered the area. "Why?" "Our client is a consortium of shipping companies losing vessels to what the Chinese military calls navigation enforcement actions, essentially harassment and seizure of commercial vessels in international waters. The situation has escalated beyond what conventional diplomatic channels can address." "You mean they need air cover for merchant shipping?" "We mean they need professionals who understand that sometimes the best way to prevent a larger conflict is to demonstrate the consequences of aggressive actions. The Chinese have been using advanced fighter aircraft to intimidate commercial vessels, and our client needs an appropriate response." Sarah understood the implications. Sterling wanted her to fly combat missions against Chinese military aircraft, potentially triggering the kind of international incident that could escalate into something much larger. That sounds like a job for the U.S. Navy. The Navy is constrained by political considerations and rules of engagement designed by committee. Our client needs results, not diplomatic protests. "What's the assignment?" 6-month contract. You'd be part of a small air wing providing security for commercial shipping operations. The pay is $300,000 for the full contract, plus combat bonuses and comprehensive insurance. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Combat flying again, real missions with real consequences. But also the kind of work that existed in legal gray areas, with clients who might not share her values and missions that could have strategic implications. What's the catch? The catch is that the South China Sea is complicated. Multiple nations claim territorial rights, and the Chinese military has been increasingly aggressive about enforcing their interpretation of international law. This isn't Afghanistan or Iraq, where you had clear rules of engagement and the full backing of the U.S. military. You're talking about mercenary work. We're talking about protecting American commercial interests in international waters. The legal framework is complex, but the mission is straightforward. Ensure that commercial vessels can operate safely in areas where they have every right to be. Sarah considered the offer. 6 months of combat flying, enough money to start over completely, and the chance to use her skills for something that mattered. But also the kind of work that operated outside official channels, with consequences. That could extend far beyond personal career considerations. When would I start? There's a flight tomorrow evening from McCarran to Hong Kong, then on to Manila. From there, Transport to the operational area. We'd need an answer within the hour. Sarah looked around her apartment at the photograph's end. Awards that represented 8 years of military service. At the dress uniform hanging in her closet that she'd probably never wear again. The Air Force had trained her, decorated her, and ultimately thrown her away for doing exactly what she'd been trained to do. "Send me the contract," she said. "Already done. Check your email." "And Ms. Mitchell, welcome to Sterling Defense Solutions." The contract was 30 pages of legal language that essentially said she'd go where Sterling sent her, fly whatever missions they assigned, and maintain operational security about everything she saw. The money was real, a $50,000 signing bonus would hit her account within 24 hours. At the bottom of the final page was a handwritten note. Some missions require pilots who understand that protecting American interests sometimes means breaking rules written by people who've never faced enemy fire. We believe you're that kind of pilot. D. Sterling. Sarah stared at the signature for a long time, then signed her name and sent the scanned contract back via secure email. 24 hours later, she was on a plane to Hong Kong, leaving behind the country that had trained her, decorated her, and ultimately discarded her for the crime of protecting American civilians. She had no idea that her decision to engage those 4 Su-35s over Nevada had been monitored by interests far beyond the U.S. Air Force, and that her new employer had plans that extended well beyond protecting commercial shipping in the South China Sea. The humidity hit Sarah Mitchell like a physical wall as she stepped off the plane at Manila's Ninoy Aquino International Airport. After 18 hours of flights through 3 time zones, her body clock was completely scrambled, but her mind remained sharp with the kind of alert tension that came from entering unfamiliar territory. The airport was a maze of languages, currencies, and faces that reminded her how far she'd traveled from the Nevada desert. Sterling Defense Solutions had provided her with a diplomatic passport that identified her as a security consultant. But the immigration officer's knowing look suggested he'd seen plenty of consultants who carried themselves like combat pilots. Her contact was waiting in the arrivals area, impossible to miss despite the crowd. 6 feet tall with the weathered complexion of someone who'd spent years in tropical climates, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that couldn't completely hide the outline of body armor underneath. His sign read, S. Mitchell, in block letters. "You're Sarah," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Rick Thompson, Sterling's operations manager for Southeast Asia. Welcome to the Philippines." Thompson's handshake was firm, but not aggressive, the grip of someone confident without needing to prove it. His accent was pure Texas, but his eyes held the kind of alertness that suggested recent experience in dangerous places. "How long have you been with Sterling?" Sarah asked as they walked toward the exit. 4 years. Started in Syria, then Somalia, now here. The company goes where governments can't or won't operate. He hefted her duffel bag without effort. "Come on, we've got a helicopter waiting. It's about a 2-hour flight to the operational area." The helicopter was a Bell 412, civilian markings but military modifications that included armor plating and defensive systems. As they lifted off from Manila's chaos, Sarah got her first look at the operational environment. That would be her home for the next 6 months. The Philippines were a maze of islands, jungle, and coastal waters that stretched to the horizon. From the air, she could see why the region was strategically important. Shipping lanes that connected the Pacific to the Indian Ocean, choke points that controlled international commerce, and enough hidden anchorages to base a small navy. Sterling's got a base on Palawan, Thompson explained over the helicopter's intercom. "It's officially a marine research station, but we've got facilities for 12 aircraft and support for about 50 personnel. The Philippine government looks the other way as long as we don't cause diplomatic incidents." Sarah studied the terrain. Below, her pilot's instincts automatically cataloging landing zones, navigation hazards, and potential threat vectors. What kind of aircraft are we flying? Mix of platforms. F-16s for air-to-air work, A-10s for ground support, and some specialized variants that don't officially exist. Your file says you're qualified on the F-16? Cross-trained 2 years ago. It's not the F-15, but I can handle it, Thompson smiled. You'll like what we've done with them. Latest avionics, advanced missiles, and some modifications that Lockheed Martin never put in their brochures. The Sterling facility appeared on the horizon like a mirage of American military efficiency transplanted into the tropical Pacific. The main runway was long enough for any aircraft in the inventory, surrounded by hardened aircraft shelters and support facilities that looked like they'd been designed by someone who understood air operations. Home sweet home, Thompson said as they approached the landing pad. Officially, we're conducting marine biology research and environmental monitoring. Unofficially, we're providing air support for commercial shipping operations that are being harassed by Chinese military forces. The base's cover story was elaborate but plausible. Research vessels, scientific equipment, and personnel who could discuss coral reef preservation with visiting officials. But Sarah could see the reality behind the facade. This was a military installation designed to project air power into the South China Sea. Her quarters were better than anything she'd had in the Air Force. A private room with air conditioning, satellite internet, and a view of the runway where she could watch aircraft operations. The other pilots lived in similar accommodations, creating a community that felt more like a high-end military contractor than a research station. Tonight's briefing is at 1900, Thompson told her. Tomorrow you'll start familiarization flights with the F-16s. After that, we'll see how quickly you adapt to the operational environment. The briefing room was equipped with secure communications, detailed charts of the South China Sea, and satellite imagery that was updated in real time. Sarah recognized the setup from her military experience. This was a professional intelligence operation with resources that rivaled anything she'd seen in the Air Force. The other pilots were an interesting mix. Jake Harrison, a former Navy top gun instructor who'd left the service after a disagreement with Pentagon budget cuts. Maria Santos, an ex-Air Force pilot who'd flown F-22s before being passed over for promotion. Tom Chun, a former Republic of China Air Force pilot who'd immigrated to the U.S. and served in the Marines. Everyone here has a story, Harrison told her during the informal introductions. And everyone here got screwed by the system in one way or another. The formal briefing began with David Sterling himself, the man whose voice Sarah had heard on the phone in Las Vegas. He was younger than she'd expected. Maybe early 40s, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested extensive experience in complex operations. Ladies and gentlemen, Sterling began, welcome to Operation Neptune's Shield. Our mission is to provide air cover for commercial shipping operations in the South China Sea, specifically protecting vessels that are being harassed by Chinese military forces. The slides that followed painted a picture of systematic intimidation. Chinese fighters buzzing commercial vessels, navigation enforcement actions that forced ships to change course, and mock attack runs that were becoming increasingly aggressive. The Chinese are testing boundaries, Sterling continued. They're using military aircraft to enforce territorial claims that aren't recognized by international law. Our job is to demonstrate that commercial vessels have the right to operate in international waters. Sarah studied the intelligence reports, noting the aircraft types and tactics being employed. The Chinese were using J-11 fighters, essentially license-built versions of the Su-27, along with J-20 stealth fighters and advanced surveillance aircraft. It was a sophisticated air force employing professional tactics. Rules of engagement are straightforward, Sterling explained. We escort commercial vessels through disputed waters. If Chinese aircraft approach our escorts, we demonstrate that we're prepared to defend our charges. If they become overtly aggressive, we respond appropriately." The carefully chosen language couldn't hide the reality. Sterling's pilots were being paid to engage in potential combat with Chinese military forces. It was exactly the kind of operation that could escalate into something much larger and more dangerous. "Any questions?" Sterling asked. Sarah raised her hand. "What's our legal status if we're forced to engage Chinese military aircraft?" "Complex," Sterling replied. "We're operating under a combination of international maritime law, commercial security provisions, and agreements with allied governments. The legal framework is solid, but it's also untested in this specific context." Translation: they were operating in a legal gray area that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on who was asking the questions. "What about backup if things go wrong?" asked Chun. "We have agreements with several regional allies, and our corporate legal team has extensive experience in international maritime law, but our primary protection is professional competence. We avoid escalation by being so skilled that potential adversaries choose not to test us." Sarah understood the strategy. Sterling was betting that Chinese pilots would be reluctant to engage Western contractors, who were obviously skilled and well-equipped. It was a high-stakes game of chicken played at 30,000 feet. The next morning, Sarah's familiarization flight introduced her to Sterling's modified F-16s. The aircraft looked standard from the outside, but the avionics were state-of-the-art. The engines were upgraded versions that provided additional power, and the weapon systems included missiles that weren't available to most air forces. "This is what $3 million in modifications looks like," her instructor pilot, Jake Harrison, explained as they climbed to altitude. "Advanced radar, electronic warfare systems, and enough firepower to handle anything the Chinese might throw at us." The F-16 felt different from the F-15 Sarah was used to. Lighter, more agile, but also more demanding in terms of pilot workload. It was a fighter designed for close combat rather than long-range interception, which made it ideal for the kind of escort missions Sterling was conducting. "The key is presence," Harrison continued as they practiced formation flying. "Most of our missions involve demonstrating that commercial vessels have professional air cover. Chinese pilots see a well-flown F-16 and usually decide they have somewhere else to be. What happens when they don't back down? Then we earn our pay." Sarah's first operational mission came 3 days later. A Japanese container ship was transiting the contested waters near the Spratly Islands, and Chinese J-11 fighters had been conducting what they called freedom of navigation patrols in the area. Sterling's job was to provide air cover for the merchant vessel. The mission brief was thorough and professional. Weather conditions, threat assessments, communication procedures, and contingency plans for various scenarios. It reminded Sarah of her military experience, but with the added complexity of operating in legal gray areas. "Remember," Sterling told the 4-ship formation during the final briefing, "we're not looking for trouble. We're demonstrating that commercial vessels have the right to operate in international waters. If Chinese aircraft approach, we maintain professional standards and avoid escalation." Sarah's F-16 was armed with a IM-12 or MRAM missiles and a full load of 20mm cannon ammunition. Enough firepower to handle most threats, but not enough to fight a sustained engagement against multiple adversaries. The container ship was a massive vessel, nearly 300 meters long and carrying thousands of containers that represented millions of dollars in international trade. From 10,000 feet, Sarah could see why these shipping lanes were so valuable. The ship was one of dozens visible on the horizon, all carrying goods between Asia and the rest of the world. "Escort flight. This is Merchant 1, the ship's captain radioed. "We're showing multiple aircraft approaching from the northeast." Sarah's radar picked up the contacts immediately. 4 J-11 fighters in loose formation, approaching at high speed. Their flight profile suggested they were conducting an intercept rather than a routine patrol. Bandit flight approaching from northeast, Sarah reported. 4 aircraft, fighter type, closing fast. The Chinese fighters approached to within 5 miles before beginning a series of aggressive maneuvers. They buzzed the merchant vessel at low altitude, conducted mock attack runs, and generally behaved in ways designed to intimidate the ship's crew. "This is the Chinese People's Liberation Army Air Force," came the radio transmission. "You are operating in Chinese territorial waters. Alter course immediately or face consequences." Sarah's mission commander, Maria Santos, responded with calm professionalism. "Chinese aircraft, this is an escort flight. This vessel is operating in international waters under international maritime law. We are providing lawful escort services." The Chinese fighters began a series of increasingly aggressive maneuvers, coming closer to the F-16s and the merchant vessel. Sarah could see the lead J-11 clearly through her canopy, its pilot visible in the cockpit as he maneuvered within a few hundred feet of her aircraft. "Escort flight, maintain professional standards," Santos radioed. "Do not escalate." But the Chinese pilots were clearly trying to provoke a response. They flew directly over the merchant vessel, conducted high-speed passes near the F-16s, and generally behaved in ways that violated every standard of air safety. Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with potential combat. The J-11s were capable aircraft flown by skilled pilots, but they were outnumbered and operating far from their home bases. If the situation escalated, Sterling's pilots would have tactical advantages. "Bandit flight is becoming increasingly aggressive," Sarah reported. "Request permission to demonstrate our capabilities." "Negative," Santos replied. "Maintain an escort. Position." The standoff continued for 20 minutes, with Chinese fighters conducting aggressive maneuvers while Sterling's pilots maintained disciplined formation. Finally, the J-11s departed, apparently satisfied that they'd made their point. About Chinese territorial claims. "Escort flight, this is Merchant 1, the ship's captain radioed. "Thank you for your professional assistance. We'll be transiting these waters regularly." As the F-16S escorted the container ship to safer waters, Sarah reflected on the complexity of her new job. Sterling's pilots were operating in a legal and political gray area, providing services that official military forces couldn't or wouldn't provide. But they were also potential flashpoints for conflicts that could escalate beyond anyone's control. "How often do encounters like that happen?" she asked Harrison during the debrief. "Couple times a week," he replied. "The Chinese are testing boundaries, seeing how far they can push before someone pushes back. So far, professional competence has been enough to avoid escalation. What happens when it isn't?" Harrison's expression grew serious. "Then we find out whether Sterling's legal team's as good as they claim to be." That evening, Sarah sat in her quarters reviewing the day's mission while watching the sun set over the South China Sea. She was earning more money than she'd ever imagined, flying combat aircraft in one of the world's most strategically important regions, and using her skills to protect commercial interests that were vital to global trade. She was also operating outside the official chain of command that had defined her military career, taking orders from corporate executives rather than military officers, and potentially risking international incidents that could affect relations between major powers. Her phone buzzed with a secure message from David Sterling. "Excellent work today. Professional competence under pressure. Your next assignment will be more challenging." Sarah deleted the message and walked to her window, looking out at the aircraft shelters where modified F-16s waited for their next mission. She joined Sterling to escape the bureaucratic constraints that had destroyed her Air Force career, but she was beginning to understand that her new job came with its own set of complications. The South China Sea was a maze of competing territorial claims, international law, and strategic interests that extended far beyond commercial shipping. Sterling's pilots were operating at the intersection of all these forces, and Sarah was beginning to suspect that their mission served purposes that went well beyond protecting merchant vessels. Her secure phone rang, displaying Sterling's number. "Sarah, we need to talk. There's been a development that changes our operational parameters." "What kind of development?" "The kind that requires pilots who aren't afraid to make difficult decisions under pressure." "Can you be in the briefing room?" "In 10 minutes?" Sarah looked at her reflection in the window, seeing the F-16 pilot who'd traded military discipline for corporate flexibility. "I'll be there." As she walked toward the briefing room, Sarah wondered if she'd made the right choice in joining Sterling. The money was real, the flying was challenging, and the mission seemed to serve legitimate purposes. But she was also beginning to understand that her new employer had objectives that extended well beyond the contracts they'd signed with shipping companies. The briefing room was empty except for Sterling himself, who was studying satellite imagery. On the main display screen, the images showed Chinese military installations on artificial islands, advanced radar systems, and what appeared to be surface-to-air missile batteries. "Sarah," Sterling said without looking up, "how would you feel about a mission that could potentially change the balance of power in the South China Sea?" Sarah felt a familiar chill. What kind of mission? The kind that requires exceptional pilots who understand that sometimes protecting American interests means taking calculated risks. As Sterling began outlining the mission parameters, Sarah realized that her decision to join Sterling Defense Solutions was about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined. The company's real objectives were becoming clear, and they had little to do with escorting merchant vessels. The satellite imagery on Sterling's briefing screen showed a cluster of artificial islands in the South China Sea, each bristling with radar installations, missile batteries, and aircraft hangars. Sarah recognized the Spratly Islands from her military intelligence briefings, but these images revealed construction activities that went far beyond what she'd seen in classified reports. "These installations weren't there 6 months ago," Sterling explained, pointing to the newest structures. "The Chinese have been working around the clock to militarize these positions. Advanced surface-to-air missiles, long-range radar systems, and fighter aircraft that can project power across the entire region." Sarah studied the intelligence photographs, her pilot's instincts automatically cataloging the defensive systems and their capabilities. The Chinese had essentially built unsinkable aircraft carriers in the middle of contested waters, creating a network of bases that could control shipping lanes worth trillions of dollars annually. "What does this have to do with escort missions?" she asked. Sterling's expression grew serious. "Our shipping clients are reporting increased harassment from aircraft operating out of these bases. The Chinese are using their new positions to enforce territorial claims that aren't recognized by international law. Commercial vessels are being forced to take longer routes, increasing costs and delays." Jake Harrison, who'd been quiet during the briefing, spoke up. "So we're going to escort ships closer to these installations?" "More than that," Sterling replied. "We're going to demonstrate that these installations don't control international waters. Freedom of navigation operations that show commercial vessels can operate safely despite Chinese military presence." Sarah understood the implications. Sterling was planning to fly combat aircraft directly into areas covered by Chinese surface-to-air missiles and fighter patrols. It was a significant escalation from the escort mission she'd been flying. "What's the operational timeline?" asked Maria Santos. 2 weeks of intensive training, then the first mission. We'll be working with a consortium of shipping companies to establish regular transit routes through disputed waters. The Chinese will undoubtedly respond, and we need to be ready for anything. The training schedule that followed was the most intensive Sarah had experienced since her initial fighter pilot training. Advanced electronic warfare procedures, low-level penetration tactics, and air-to-air combat maneuvering that pushed both pilots and aircraft to their limits. The Chinese have been studying American tactics for decades, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, Sterling's intelligence analyst. They know our standard operating procedures, our training manuals, and our historical patterns. We need to be unpredictable. Walsh was a former CI analyst who'd spent years studying Chinese military capabilities. Her briefings revealed a sophisticated adversary that had learned from American military interventions and developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize Western air power. The J-20 stealth fighter is their most advanced aircraft. Walsh continued, displaying technical specifications that made Sarah's blood run cold. It's designed specifically to counter F-16s and F-15s, longer range, advanced stealth characteristics, and missiles that can engage targets beyond visual range. Sarah had heard rumors about the J-20 during her Air Force service, but the detailed intelligence Sterling provided was sobering. The Chinese had developed a fighter that could potentially defeat the aircraft she was flying. What about our countermeasures? Asked Tom Chun, the former Republic of China Air Force pilot. That's where our modifications come in, Sterling replied. Your F-16s have been upgraded with systems that aren't available to most air forces. Advanced electronic warfare capabilities, improved radar, and missiles that can engage stealth targets. The technical briefings that followed revealed the extent of Sterling's modifications. The F-16s were essentially new aircraft built around the original airframe, with avionics that rivaled anything in the U.S. inventory and weapon systems that incorporated the latest technology. Where did you get this equipment? Sarah asked. During a break in the briefings. Relationships built over many years, Sterling replied carefully. Defense contractors, foreign governments, and research institutions that understand the importance of maintaining technological advantages. Sarah suspected the answer was more complex than Sterling was willing to admit. The modifications to their aircraft represented millions of dollars in research and development, suggesting resources that went well beyond a private military company's normal capabilities. The flight training began with basic familiarization with the upgraded systems. Sarah's F-16 now had a radar that could track multiple targets simultaneously, electronic warfare systems that could jam enemy communications, and missiles that could engage targets at ranges she'd never experienced. The key is integration, explained Captain Rob Martinez, Sterling's lead instructor pilot. These systems work together to create capabilities that exceed the sum of their parts. But they also require extensive training to employ effectively. Martinez was a former Air Force Test Pilot School graduate who'd left the service to join Sterling's development program. His expertise in experimental aircraft systems was evident in the way he explained the complex interactions between radar, electronic warfare, and weapon systems. The Chinese expect us to fight the way the Air Force taught us, Martinez continued. Standard tactics, predictable patterns, and conservative engagement parameters. We're going to do something different. The new tactics were unlike anything Sarah had learned in military training. Instead of the structured approaches favored by the Air Force, Sterling's pilots were taught to be unpredictable, aggressive, and willing to take risks that military commanders would never approve of. Commercial clients don't have time for committee decisions, Martinez explained during a particularly intense training session. They need results, and they need them quickly. That means making decisions faster than your opponents can react. Sarah's first advanced training mission took place at night, using terrain-following radar to penetrate simulated enemy defenses at extremely low altitude. The modified F-16 handled the stress well, but Sarah found herself working harder than she'd ever worked in a cockpit. The Chinese have excellent radar coverage, Martinez explained over the radio. But they're not expecting attacks from directions that would be suicide for conventional aircraft. We're going to exploit that assumption. The training missions became increasingly complex, incorporating electronic warfare, multiple aircraft, coordination, and engagement scenarios that pushed every system to its limits. Sarah found herself flying missions that would have been impossible in her unmodified F-15, using capabilities that officially didn't exist. "How legal is this equipment?" she asked Harrison during a maintenance break. "Depends on who's asking," he replied. "The basic systems are commercial derivatives of military technology. The advanced components came from research programs that may or may not have been officially terminated." Sarah understood the implications. Sterling was operating aircraft that incorporated classified technology, possibly without official authorization. It was another layer of legal complexity that made her situation even more precarious. The weapons training was equally intensive. Sarah learned to employ missiles she'd never seen before, engage targets at ranges that seemed impossible, and coordinate attacks with aircraft using data links that provided real-time tactical information. The AIM-260 is officially still in development, Martinez explained as they loaded the advanced missiles onto her F-16. But Sterling has access to pre-production models that are fully functional. Range exceeds 100 nautical miles, and the Seeker can engage stealth targets. Sarah examined the sleek missile that looked like nothing she'd seen in Air Force inventory. The weapon was longer than standard AMRAAM is, with a more sophisticated Seeker head and what appeared to be a larger warhead. "Where did Sterling get developmental weapons?" "Relationships," Martinez replied with a slight smile. "The company has contracts with several defense contractors, and sometimes prototype systems need operational testing." The implications were staggering. Sterling was essentially conducting live-fire testing of advanced weapon systems using private military contractors. Sarah was beginning to understand that her new employer had connections that extended deep into the military-industrial complex. The electronic warfare training was perhaps the most complex aspect of Sterling's program. Sarah learned to operate systems that could jam enemy radar, intercept communications, and create false targets that would confuse hostile aircraft. "The Chinese rely heavily on integrated air defenses," explained Dr. Walsh during a technical briefing. "Their surface-to-air missiles and fighter aircraft are connected through sophisticated data links. If we can disrupt those links, we can create opportunities for penetration." The electronic warfare systems in Sarah's F-16 were unlike anything she'd encountered in military service. They could operate across multiple frequency bands simultaneously, creating a complex pattern of jamming and deception that would confuse even sophisticated adversaries. "This is more advanced than anything the Air Force has deployed," Sarah observed during a training mission. "The Air Force has to get congressional approval for every modification," Martinez replied. "Sterling just needs to prove that the systems work effectively." Sarah was beginning to understand that Sterling operated in a different world than the military she'd known. Decisions were made quickly, resources were allocated based on effectiveness rather than politics, and operational requirements trumped regulatory constraints. The culmination of her training was a complex mission that simulated penetration of Chinese air defenses around the Spratly Islands. Sarah flew with a 4-ship formation, using electronic warfare to suppress enemy radar while engaging simulated fighter aircraft and surface-to-air missiles. "This is what we'll be facing," Martinez explained during the mission debrief. "Multiple threats, sophisticated countermeasures, and opponents who understand our capabilities. Success depends on being better prepared and more professional than they expect." The mission results were impressive. Sarah's formation had successfully penetrated the simulated defenses, engaged multiple targets, and extracted without losses. But the exercise had also revealed the risks they'd be taking when they faced real Chinese defenses. "The margins are thin," Sterling admitted during the final briefing. "We're asking you to operate at the edge of what's possible using equipment that's still being developed against opponents who are skilled and well-equipped." Sarah looked around the briefing room at her fellow pilots. Each of them had been recruited from the military, after being discarded by bureaucratic systems that prioritized politics over performance. They were all skilled, motivated, and slightly desperate for the chance to prove themselves again. "What happens if we're shot down?" asked Santos. "Sterling has agreements with several regional allies for search and rescue operations," Sterling replied. "But honestly, the best protection is professional competence. We avoid being shot down by being better than our opponents." The legal briefing that followed was as complex as the technical training. Sterling's operations existed in a gray area between commercial security, military contracting, and mercenary work. The company had lawyers in multiple countries working to ensure their operations remained within legal boundaries. "The key is that we're defending commercial vessels in international waters," explained Sterling's chief counsel, a former Navy JAG officer named Commander Patricia Brooks. "International maritime law provides clear authority for security services, even if the specific methods are unconventional." Sarah studied the legal documents, noting the careful language and multiple jurisdictions involved. Sterling had constructed a legal framework that would protect their operations, but she suspected it would collapse under serious scrutiny. "What about advanced weapons and aircraft modifications?" she asked. "Complex," Brooks replied. "But the fundamental principle is that we're operating under commercial security contracts that allow for appropriate defensive measures." The final element of Sarah's preparation was cultural briefings about the region where she'd be operating. The South China Sea was a complex maze of competing territorial claims, historical grievances, and strategic interests that affected multiple nations. "The Chinese see this as a core national interest," explained Dr. Walsh. "They believe the South China Sea is their rightful territory, and they're willing to use military force to defend that claim. Our operations challenge that assumption." Sarah understood the strategic implications. Sterling's missions weren't just about protecting commercial shipping. They were about challenging Chinese territorial claims and demonstrating that other nations wouldn't accept Chinese hegemony over critical sea lanes. "Are we prepared for the possibility of a larger conflict?" she asked. Sterling's job is to prevent larger conflicts by demonstrating that aggressive actions have consequences. Sterling replied, "The Chinese are more likely to negotiate if they understand that military intimidation won't work." As Sarah's training concluded, she felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She was better prepared than she'd ever been for air combat, flying aircraft with capabilities that exceeded anything in her military experience. But she was also about to operate in a region where miscalculation could trigger conflicts between major powers. Her final briefing was one-on-one with Sterling himself, conducted in his private office overlooking the runway where modified F-16s waited for their next mission. "Sarah, you've exceeded every expectation during training," Sterling began. "Your performance has been exceptional, and your fellow pilots respect your leadership." "Thank you, sir. I'm offering you a position as flight leader for our most challenging missions. The pay increase is substantial, but the responsibilities are significant. You'd be making tactical decisions that could affect international relations." Sarah considered the offer. Flight leader meant more money, more responsibility, and more exposure to the legal and political complexities of Sterling's operations. It also meant being at the center of missions that could escalate beyond anyone's control. "What's the first mission?" Sterling smiled. "A freedom of navigation operation that will demonstrate whether the Chinese are willing to back up their territorial claims with military force. You'll be leading a 4-ship formation into the most heavily defended waters in the South China Sea." As Sarah walked back to her quarters that evening, she reflected on how far she'd come from the court-martial that had destroyed her Air Force career. Sterling had given her the opportunity to fly again, to use her skills for missions that mattered, and to work with equipment that represented the cutting edge of military technology. But she was also operating in a world where the rules were unclear, the stakes were enormous, and the consequences of failure could extend far beyond personal career considerations. Her next mission would test everything she'd learned and determine whether Sterling's approach to private military contracting could succeed in one of the world's most dangerous regions. The South China Sea was about to become a testing ground for new forms of warfare, and Sarah Mitchell was about to find herself at the center of it all. The pre-dawn darkness over the South China Sea was broken only by the navigation lights of Sarah's F-16 as she led her four-ship formation toward the contested waters surrounding Mischief Reef. 200 miles ahead lay the most heavily fortified artificial island in the Spratly chain, bristling with radar installations and surface-to-air missile batteries that could engage targets at ranges exceeding 150 nautical miles. Dragonflight, this is Overwatch, came the voice of Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Sterling's Intelligence Center. Satellite imagery shows increased activity at the target area. Multiple aircraft launches were detected in the past hour. Sarah's heads-up display showed the tactical situation in stark detail. Red symbols indicated known Chinese military positions, while blue symbols marked the merchant vessels they were escorting. The shipping lane they were about to enter had been closed to commercial traffic for 3 weeks due to military exercises. But Sterling's client had decided to challenge that closure. Copy, Overwatch. Dragonflight is proceeding as planned. The merchant vessel below them was the Pacific Endeavour, a massive container ship carrying automotive parts from South Korea to Singapore. The ship's captain, a veteran mariner named Robert Kim, had agreed to pay Sterling's premium rates for an escort through disputed waters, rather than accept the delays and costs of alternate routes. Dragon Lead, this is Pacific Endeavour. Captain Kim's voice crackled over the radio. We're showing multiple surface contacts approaching from the northwest. Chinese Coast Guard vessels look like they're moving to intercept. Sarah switched her radar to surface search mode, immediately picking up the approaching vessels. 3 large cutters and several smaller patrol boats, all converging on the merchant ship's position with obvious intent to force a course change. Overwatch, Dragon Lead. Recommend we maintain current altitude and demonstrate presence. Chinese surface vessels are moving to intercept our escort. Dragon Lead, be advised we're tracking airborne contacts launching from Mischief Reef. 4 aircraft, fighter type, bearing 315 degrees and closing. Sarah's threat warning system remained quiet, but she could see the approaching aircraft on her radar display. J-11 fighters, moving fast and climbing to intercept altitude. The formation was professional, disciplined, and clearly intent on challenging Sterling's presence in what China considered its territorial waters. Dragon Flight, spread formation and maintain escort position. We're not looking for trouble, but we're not backing down either. The J-11 fighters approached from the northwest, their flight profile suggesting they were conducting a standard intercept rather than an immediate attack. But Sarah had learned not to underestimate Chinese pilots, who were skilled professionals. Flying capable aircraft. American aircraft, this is People's Liberation Army Navy Air Force, came the transmission on the international emergency frequency. You are operating in Chinese territorial waters. Depart immediately or face consequences. Sarah keyed her microphone, her voice calm and professional. Chinese aircraft, this is a commercial escort flight. We are operating in international waters. Under international maritime law, our escort is proceeding on lawful navigation. The lead J-11 closed to within 500 meters of Sarah's F-16, close enough for her to see the pilot's helmet and the weapons pylons beneath his aircraft. The Chinese fighter was armed with Place 12 air-to-air missiles and a full load of cannon ammunition. Dragon Lead, Overwatch. We're showing additional launches from Fiery Cross Reef. 2 more 4-ship formations, bearing 045 and 180 degrees. Sarah's blood ran cold. 12 Chinese fighters converged on their position, all armed and clearly intent on forcing the Sterling formation to withdraw. The odds were 3-1 against, and the Chinese had the advantage of operating near their own bases. Dragon flight, maintain formation integrity. We're going to demonstrate professional competence without escalating. The first J-11 formation began a series of aggressive maneuvers designed to intimidate the Sterling pilots. High-speed passes, close approaches, and mock attack runs that violated every principle of air safety. Sarah maintained her position and heading, refusing to be drawn into reactive maneuvering. Dragon lead, this is Dragon 3, called Tom Chen, the former Republic of China Air Force pilot. I'm picking up radar illumination from the surface. Looks like they're painting us with fire control systems. Sarah's radar warning receiver confirmed Chen's report. The Chinese had activated their surface-to-air missile systems, creating a complex threat environment that extended from sea level to 80,000 feet. If the situation escalated, Sterling's F-16s would be facing both airborne and surface threats simultaneously. Overwatch Dragon lead, request immediate threat assessment on surface-to-air missile systems. Dragon lead, we're showing multiple SAM sites active. HQ to 9 systems with engagement envelopes covering your entire operational area. Recommend you maintain current altitude and heading to avoid triggering automated defenses. The HQ to 9 was China's most advanced surface-to-air missile system, capable of engaging multiple targets simultaneously at ranges exceeding 200 kilometers. Sarah's formation was well within the engagement envelope, but the Chinese hadn't yet fired. They were demonstrating capability without committing to attack. Dragon flight, this is Dragon 2, called Jake Harrison. The lead bandit is trying to crowd me out of formation. Getting pretty aggressive. Sarah could see Harrison's F-16 through her canopy, with a J-11 fighter maneuvering aggressively just meters away. The Chinese pilot was skilled, maintaining formation while clearly trying to force Harrison into evasive maneuvers. Dragon 2, hold your position. We're not going to be intimidated. But the Chinese formation was becoming increasingly aggressive. The second 4-ship element had arrived and was conducting coordinated maneuvers that boxed in Sterling's aircraft. Sarah found herself surrounded by J-11 fighters, all flying in close formation while maintaining obvious weapons locks. Dragon lead, Pacific Endeavor. The Chinese Coast Guard is demanding we have to board. They're claiming we're carrying contraband cargo. Sarah understood the tactic. The Chinese were using their Coast Guard to detain the merchant vessel while their Air Force dealt with the Sterling escort. Once the Pacific Endeavor was boarded, the Chinese could claim they'd found evidence of smuggling or other violations. Pacific Endeavor, maintain course and speed. We're going to escort you through this harassment. The third Chinese formation arrived as Sarah's fuel gauge showed she was approaching the point of no return. The J-11s were taking turns conducting close passes, each one more aggressive than the last. Sarah's pilots were maintaining professional discipline, but the situation was becoming untenable. Dragon lead, Overwatch. We're picking up communications intelligence that suggests the Chinese are planning to force you down. Multiple airfields are being prepared for emergency landings. The implications were clear. The Chinese weren't just trying to intimidate Sterling's formation. They were preparing to capture both aircraft and pilots. Sarah had walked into a carefully planned trap. Dragon flight, be advised we may need to execute emergency procedures. Prepare for immediate departure from the area. But as Sarah began planning her extraction, her electronic warfare systems detected something that changed everything. The Chinese fighters were communicating on frequencies that Sterling's intelligence network had been monitoring for months. Their tactical coordination was being conducted through data links that Dr. Walsh's team had partially cracked. Overwatch. Dragon lead. Are you copying Chinese tactical communications? Affirmative, Dragon lead. We're getting real-time intelligence on their intentions. Stand by for analysis. The intelligence that followed was disturbing. The Chinese formation was coordinating not just with each other, but with a much larger force that included submarines, surface vessels, and additional aircraft that weren't yet visible on Sterling's sensors. This wasn't a spontaneous response to Sterling's escort mission. It was a carefully orchestrated operation. Dragon Lead, this appears to be a pre-planned exercise. Chinese forces are treating your presence as an opportunity to test their integrated air defense systems. Sarah realized she'd been maneuvered into serving as a live training target for Chinese military forces. Sterling's escort mission had been anticipated, and the Chinese were using the encounter to evaluate their own capabilities against Western air power. Dragonflight were being used as training targets. Maintain alert status and prepare for coordinated evasive maneuvers. The Chinese fighters began a new series of maneuvers that were clearly designed to test Sterling's electronic warfare capabilities. They activated different radar modes, employed various jamming techniques, and generally probed the F-16's defensive systems. Dragon Lead, they're trying to map our electronic signatures, reported Maria Santos. Multiple active scans, different frequency bands. Sarah's electronic warfare officer, monitoring the engagement from Sterling's intelligence center, confirmed. The assessment. Dragon Lead, recommend you activate full countermeasures. They're collecting intelligence on our capabilities. Sarah faced a difficult decision. Activating her F-16's full electronic warfare suite would demonstrate Sterling's advanced capabilities, but it would also reveal technology that the Chinese didn't know existed. The information could be used to develop countermeasures that would compromise future operations. Dragonflight, activate standard countermeasures only. We're not going to show them everything we've got. The Chinese response was immediate and professional. As soon as Sterling's aircraft activated their jamming systems, the J-11 fighters adjusted their tactics to compensate. These weren't amateur pilots learning on the job. They were experienced professionals conducting systematic intelligence collection. Dragon Lead, Pacific Endeavor. Chinese Coast Guard vessels are taking positions to box us in. They're demanding we stop the engines and prepare for boarding. Sarah's fuel state was becoming critical. She had perhaps 20 minutes of combat fuel remaining, not enough to fight her way out if the Chinese decided to escalate. But abandoning the merchant vessel would mean Sterling's first major mission had failed. Overwatch Dragon Lead, request immediate support. We need options. Dragon Lead, be advised that additional Sterling assets are en route. ATA 15 minutes. Sarah didn't know what additional assets Sterling had available, but she hoped they would be enough to change the tactical balance. The Chinese had committed significant forces to this engagement, and she was beginning to understand that Sterling's operations had attracted high-level attention. Dragonflight, maintain escort position. Help is on the way. But the Chinese formation was becoming more aggressive. Sarah watched through her canopy as the lead J-11 began what appeared to be a gun tracking pass, positioning himself for a cannon attack that would be impossible to ignore. The pilot's intentions were clear: force Sterling's aircraft to abandon their escort or face the consequences. Dragon Lead, the lead bandit is going hot. He's tracking me with his gun. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She pulled her F-16 into a climbing turn that broke the J-11's tracking solution while maintaining her escort position. The Chinese fighter followed, but Sarah's modified aircraft had performance advantages that became apparent in the vertical maneuvering. Dragonflight demonstrates professional competence. We're not going to be intimidated. The Chinese pilots were skilled, but Sarah's formation had been trained for exactly this kind of engagement. They maintained their escort position while demonstrating that they could outmaneuver the J-11s if necessary. The message was clear: Sterling's pilots were professionals who couldn't be easily intimidated. Dragon Lead, overwatch. Chinese communications indicate they're preparing to disengage. Multiple formations are receiving recall orders. Sarah's radar display confirmed the intelligence. The Chinese fighters were beginning to withdraw, their systematic intelligence collection apparently complete. But as they departed, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. Overwatch Dragon Lead. Chinese formations are being replaced by different aircraft. I'm showing new contacts approaching from multiple directions. The new aircraft were different from the J-11s that had been harassing Sterling's formation. These were larger, more sophisticated, and flying in formations that suggested a different level of capability. Sarah's identification friend or foe system couldn't classify them, which meant they were either very new or employing advanced stealth technology. Dragon Lead, those appear to be J-20 stealth fighters. We're showing 4 aircraft, possibly more that we can't track. Sarah's mouth went dry. The J-20 was China's most advanced fighter, designed specifically to counter American air power. If the Chinese were committing their newest aircraft to this engagement, it meant they considered Sterling's operations a serious threat. Dragon Flight, new game. We're now facing their first team aircraft. Maintain formation and prepare for advanced tactics. The J-20 fighters approached differently than the J-11s had. Instead of aggressive maneuvering, they maintained professional formations while obviously collecting intelligence on Sterling's capabilities. Their stealth characteristics made them difficult to track, but Sarah's modified radar was providing intermittent contacts. Dragon Lead, this is Dragon 4, called the newest member of Sarah's formation. I'm picking up missile lock warnings. Multiple threats. Sarah's radar warning receiver confirmed the threat. The J-20s were painting Sterling's aircraft with their fire control radars, demonstrating that they could engage at any time. The message was clear. The Chinese had escalated to their most capable aircraft, and Sterling's formation was outgunned. Overwatch Dragon Lead, we need those additional assets now. The Chinese have committed J-20s to this engagement. Dragon Lead, Sterling assets are 2 minutes out. Maintain my current position. As Sarah's fuel gauge approached critical levels, she realized that Sterling's escort mission had revealed something significant about Chinese military capabilities. The coordinated response, the intelligence collection, and the commitment of advanced aircraft suggested that Sterling's operations were being taken seriously at the highest levels of Chinese military leadership. Dragon Flight, we've accomplished our mission. Chinese forces have revealed their response capabilities, and we've demonstrated that commercial vessels can operate in disputed waters with appropriate escort. But as Sarah began planning her withdrawal, she noticed something on her radar that changed everything. Among the J-20 fighters approaching her formation was one aircraft that didn't match the others. It was larger, more sophisticated, and flying in a way that suggested it wasn't just another fighter. Overwatch Dragon Lead, I'm showing an unidentified aircraft mixed in with the J-20 formation. Different signature, different flight characteristics. The response from Sterling's intelligence center was immediate and alarming. Dragon Lead, that appears to be a developmental aircraft. Something we've never seen before. Recommend you maintain visual contact and collect intelligence. Sarah realized that her escort mission had stumbled into something much larger than commercial shipping harassment. The Chinese were using Sterling's presence to test not just their standard military capabilities, but experimental aircraft that represented the cutting edge of their military technology. As additional Sterling assets arrived to support her formation, Sarah understood that her mission had revealed a new level of Chinese military capability. The question was whether Sterling's operations were sophisticated enough to handle what they'd discovered, or whether they'd stumbled into something that was beyond their ability to manage. The South China Sea was about to become a testing ground for military technologies that could change the balance of power in the region. And Sarah Mitchell was about to find herself at the center of a conflict that extended far beyond protecting commercial shipping. The additional sterling assets that appeared on Sarah's radar weren't what she expected. Instead of more F-16s or conventional support aircraft, her sensors detected something that made her question everything she thought she knew about her employer. The approaching aircraft had stealth characteristics that rivaled the Chinese J-20s, but their electronic signatures were completely unfamiliar. "Dragon Lead, this is Phantom 1, came a new voice on Sterling's tactical frequency. "We're assuming overwatch of your mission. Maintain the current position and prepare for coordinated extraction." Sarah's radar couldn't get a solid lock on the newcomer, but she could see it visually through her canopy. The aircraft was unlike anything in her experience, angular, stealthy, and flying with a performance envelope that suggested technology beyond current military standards. "Phantom 1, Dragon Lead. What type of aircraft are you flying?" "Classified Dragon Lead. Just know that we're here to even the odds." Sarah's electronic warfare systems began detecting transmissions that made her blood run cold. The mysterious Sterling aircraft weren't just providing air cover. They were actively jamming Chinese communications and disrupting the J-20 formation's coordination. The level of electronic warfare capability was beyond anything she'd seen. "Dragon Flight, be advised that Chinese formations are experiencing communication difficulties," reported Dr. Walsh from Sterling's Intelligence Center. "Multiple systems appear to be compromised." Sarah watched through her canopy as the J-20 fighters began breaking formation, their pilots clearly struggling with degraded sensor systems. The mysterious Sterling aircraft had somehow neutralized the most advanced fighters in the Chinese inventory without firing a shot. But as the Chinese fighters withdrew, Sarah noticed something that made her stomach clench. The mysterious Sterling aircraft were turning toward her formation, their weapon systems active and tracking her F-16s. "Dragon Lead, this is Phantom 1. You and your formation are ordered to accompany us to alternate coordinates. Non-compliance will result in immediate engagement." Sarah's mind raced as she processed the implications. The aircraft that had rescued her formation were now threatening them. Whatever Sterling's true objectives were, they clearly extended beyond protecting commercial shipping. "Phantom 1, Dragon Lead. Request clarification on mission authority." "Dragon Lead, you've seen too much today. Sterling's operations require a higher level of operational security than your current clearance allows." Sarah's fuel gauge was approaching critical levels, but she was beginning to understand that her troubles were far from over. The mysterious Sterling aircraft were positioning themselves to escort her formation to an unknown destination, and their weapon systems remained active. "Dragon Flight, maintain formation integrity. We appear to be under new orders." As Sarah's formation was escorted toward coordinates that didn't appear on any chart, she realized that the escort mission had been a setup from the beginning. Sterling hadn't been protecting commercial shipping. They'd been testing Chinese capabilities, while evaluating their own pilots for missions that went far beyond private military contracting. "Dragon Lead, this is Dragon 2, called Jake Harrison. Our escorts are taking us toward that island that doesn't exist on the charts." Sarah could see their destination through her canopy, a small island that appeared uninhabited but was clearly equipped with sophisticated facilities. As they approached, she could make out aircraft hangars, radar installations, and what appeared to be a significant military presence. "Dragon Flight, you're cleared to land on runway 09. Ground control will provide taxi instructions." The island's runway was long enough for any aircraft in the inventory, surrounded by facilities that looked like they'd been designed for advanced military operations. Sarah's F-16 touched down on what was clearly a highly classified installation that operated under complete secrecy. "Welcome to Site November," announced the ground controller. "Dragon Flight, taxi to the secure hangar complex. Do not shut down your aircraft until instructed." As Sarah's formation taxied toward the hangars, She could see the scope of Sterling's operations. Advanced aircraft that she couldn't identify, support facilities that rivaled anything she'd seen in the Air Force, and personnel who carried themselves like elite military units. Dragon Flight, shut down your aircraft and exit immediately. You'll be escorted to the briefing facility. Sarah climbed out of her F-16 to find herself surrounded by security personnel who were clearly not ordinary contractors. Their equipment, training, and bearing suggested special operations backgrounds, and their weapons were at the ready. "Captain Mitchell, you and your pilots will accompany us to the secure briefing facility," announced the security team leader. "Your aircraft will be processed while you're in debrief." The secure briefing facility was unlike anything Sarah had seen before. Multiple layers of security, communication systems that suggested global connectivity, and intelligence displays that showed real-time information about military operations worldwide. David Sterling was waiting for her, but he wasn't alone. The room was filled with personnel who clearly represented multiple government agencies, defense contractors, and what appeared to be foreign intelligence services. "Sarah, excellent work today," Sterling began. "Your performance under pressure was exceptional, and you've provided us with valuable intelligence about Chinese capabilities. More importantly, you've demonstrated the skills we need for our most sensitive operations. Sir, I need to understand what just happened out there. The aircraft that provided support, the merchant vessel's course change, the level of electronic warfare capability, none of this matches what I was briefed about Sterling's operations." Sterling gestured to the assembled personnel. "Sarah, you've proven yourself to be a skilled pilot and a professional who can handle complex situations. It's time you understood the full scope of what Sterling Defense Solutions actually does." One of the civilians, a woman in her 40s with the careful bearing of a senior intelligence officer, leaned forward. "Captain Mitchell, I'm Deputy Director Angela Morrison from the Central Intelligence Agency. Sterling Defense Solutions operates as a joint venture between multiple U.S. government agencies and allied intelligence services." Sarah felt the world shift beneath her feet. "You're saying Sterling is a front for multiple intelligence agencies?" "Sterling is a legitimate private military contractor that provides services that official military forces cannot," Morrison replied. "But we've developed capabilities that extend far beyond conventional private military contracting." Sterling activated a wall display that showed a global map with overlays indicating operations on multiple continents. "The Chinese militarization of the South China Sea is just one aspect of a larger strategic competition. Sterling provides services that help maintain the balance of power in multiple regions." Sarah studied the intelligence displays, beginning to understand the complexity of what she'd been drawn into. Sterling wasn't just a private military contractor. It was part of a global intelligence operation that used advanced technology and skilled personnel to conduct operations that official agencies couldn't attempt. "What about the aircraft that supported us? The ones with stealth capabilities?" Morrison and Sterling exchanged glances before Morrison responded. "Those were prototype aircraft developed through joint programs between defense contractors and intelligence agencies. Your mission provided an opportunity to test their effectiveness against peer adversaries." "You're saying I was part of a test program for experimental military aircraft?" "You were part of an operation that served multiple objectives," Morrison said carefully. "Intelligence collection, capability demonstration, technology evaluation, and personnel assessment." Sarah felt a mixture of anger and understanding. She'd been recruited not just for her piloting skills, but because her court-martial had made her desperate enough to accept missions that official military personnel couldn't fly. "The other pilots in my formation, do they know about this?" "Each pilot is briefed according to their security clearance and operational requirements," Sterling replied. "You're receiving this briefing because your performance has qualified you for our most sensitive operations. Morrison pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah satellite imagery that made her stomach clench. The images showed military installations on islands throughout the Pacific, advanced aircraft that didn't appear in any official inventory, and what appeared to be a shadow military force that operated independently of official command structures. The global security environment requires capabilities that official military forces cannot provide, Morrison explained. Sterling has been developed to fill that gap, using advanced technology and skilled personnel to conduct operations that serve multiple national interests. Sarah studied the imagery, recognizing the implications. Sterling wasn't just serving American interests. It was part of a multinational intelligence operation that used private contractors to conduct operations that official agencies couldn't attempt. How long has this been going on? Several years, Sterling replied. The changing nature of international conflicts required new approaches to intelligence collection and operational capability. Sterling represents the evolution of how democratic nations protect their interests. Sarah looked at the assembled personnel, beginning to understand that she'd been recruited into something much larger than she'd imagined. What happens now? That depends on your willingness to accept the full scope of Sterling's operations, Morrison replied. We have missions that require pilots with your skills and security clearance. The compensation would be substantial, but the commitments are correspondingly significant. Sterling activated another display that showed mission parameters for operations on multiple continents. Sarah, you've already proven that you're willing to make difficult decisions when democratic interests are at stake. That's exactly the kind of professional we need for our most sensitive operations. Sarah thought about her court-martial, her dismissal from the Air Force, and the career that had been destroyed because she'd chosen to protect American civilians. Now she was being offered the chance to serve broader democratic interests, but through channels that didn't officially exist. What kind of missions? Sterling activated a wall display that showed targeting information from military installations in multiple countries. Intelligence indicates that authoritarian regimes are developing capabilities that could threaten democratic nations throughout the world. We need pilots who can conduct reconnaissance and, if necessary, precision strikes against these targets. Sarah studied the mission parameters, recognizing the implications. Sterling was planning operations that would essentially constitute a global shadow war, using private contractors who could be disavowed if operations went wrong. This is beyond anything I signed up for. This is exactly what you signed up for, Morrison replied. You joined Sterling because you were frustrated with bureaucratic constraints that prevented you from protecting democratic interests. We're offering you the chance to make a real difference on a global scale. Sarah looked at the intelligence displays, the mission parameters, and the faces of the people who were asking her to risk everything for operations that wouldn't officially exist. She'd spent her entire career following orders and trusting that her superiors understood the larger strategic picture. What guarantee do I have that democratic governments will support these operations if they're discovered? Morrison's expression was carefully neutral. You have the same guarantees that any intelligence operative has. Professional competence is your primary protection, and operational success is your best insurance. Sarah understood the message. If she was captured or killed during Sterling's operations, official governments would deny any involvement. She would be operating without official support or legal protection. But as she looked around the room at the assembled personnel, Sarah realized that she'd found something she'd been searching for since her court-martial. These were professionals who understood that protecting democratic interests sometimes required accepting risks that official agencies couldn't take. I accept, Sarah said. Sterling smiled. Welcome to Sterling's Advanced Operations Division. Your first mission will be in 72 hours. As Sarah left the secure briefing room, she realized that her involvement with Sterling Defense Solutions had reached its logical conclusion. She'd been recruited into a global intelligence operation that used advanced technology and skilled personnel to protect democratic interests worldwide. The choice would determine not just her future, but potentially the future of how democratic nations protected their interests in an increasingly complex world. Sarah Mitchell, the pilot who'd been court-martialed for protecting American civilians, had found her place in a global operation that extended far beyond national boundaries. 6 months later, Sarah Mitchell stood in the cockpit of an aircraft that officially didn't exist, preparing for a mission that would never appear in any official records. The South China Sea stretched out before her, but her target was a facility that threatened democratic interests on multiple continents. Her F-35X had been modified with technology that pushed the boundaries of what was possible, carrying weapons that could engage targets with unprecedented precision. The mission she was about to fly would test every skill she'd developed and every principle she'd learned. "Phoenix Lead, this is Control," came the voice from Sterling's Global Operations Center. "You are cleared for launch. The weather is optimal, and the target area is clear of civilian traffic." Sarah's aircraft lifted off from a runway that didn't appear on any chart, climbing toward an altitude where she could operate undetected by conventional surveillance systems. The stealth characteristics were more advanced than anything she'd flown before, making her virtually invisible to hostile sensors. "Phoenix Lead, target area is showing normal activity patterns. No indication of increased alert status." Sarah's navigation system showed the target, a facility that was developing weapons capable of threatening democratic nations worldwide. Intelligence had confirmed that the installation represented a clear and present danger to global stability. "Phoenix Lead, you are cleared to engage. Execute on my mark." Sarah's targeting system locked onto the facility, her advanced weapons programmed to destroy the threat while minimizing collateral damage. The mission would eliminate a strategic threat while demonstrating that democratic nations possess the capability to protect their interests. Mark, the precision strike that followed was invisible to most of the world, but its effects would be felt for years to come. Sarah Mitchell had found her place in a global operation that protected democratic interests through methods that official agencies couldn't employ. As she returned to base, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her from a court-martial in Nevada to a precision strike that had eliminated a global threat. Sterling Defense Solutions had given her the opportunity to serve democratic interests on a global scale, using skills that had been honed through years of training and experience. The shadow war between democratic nations and authoritarian regimes would continue, but Sarah Mitchell had proven that skilled professionals could make a difference when official agencies were constrained by political considerations. Her choice to accept Sterling's offer had led to a career that extended far beyond national boundaries, serving interests that transcended any single government. The future would bring new missions, new challenges, and new opportunities to protect democratic interests worldwide. Sarah Mitchell had found her place in that future, and she was ready for whatever came next. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.